Strabo and the World. Several years, or possibly only a year, before Tiberius went to Rhodes, a ship sailed from the harbor of Alexandria carrying an important traveler, a man in his middle 50s with streaks of gray in his black hair. He stood in the stern of the ship until they were far out to sea, watching with particular interest the way in which the great lighthouse gradually disappeared below the waterline, until only the tip was visible, and then that too was gone. A never-failing source of interest to him was this constant proof that the surface of the sea was curved and the earth was round. For this traveler was Strabo, the geographer. After his trip up the Nile with his friend, the Roman governor, on which they had gone as far as the borders of Ethiopia, Strabo had returned to Alexandria to study in the library. There he had pored over the works of all the old Greek philosophers who had written of geography in the past. Now, with many rolls of notes that he had made, and with his mind full of things that he had seen, Strabo was leaving Egypt for Rome. This was his first visit to the city of the West. He had arrived in Rome for the first time in 44 BC, the year that Julius Caesar had been murdered. Strabo was then a boy of 19, having been born the same year as Augustus. His birthplace was Amasia, a city in Pontus, not far from the border of Armenia. His parents, being wealthy and well able to do so, had sent their son to Rome, thinking possibly that a view of the West might round out his education. In Rome, young Strabo had studied with the sons of Cicero under the same tutor. There he had also first read Julius Caesar's book about his war in Gaul. Caesar's description of the wild country, the forests of Germany, the foggy island of Britain, may well have aroused Strabo's first interest in geography. Although he had begun his career by writing history, now at 50 it was Strabo's ambition to make a geography of the world. "Why write another geography?" inquired someone to whom he had confided his purpose, someone perhaps on shipboard with whom he had fallen into conversation. "My excuse," said Strabo, "is that I believe that I shall be able to make at least some small addition to what the others have said. The conquests of the Romans and the Parthians had added to our knowledge of the world, just as the campaigns of Alexander the Great did in earlier times. The Romans have opened all of the western part of Europe, and the Parthians have increased our knowledge of the Scyths who lived in the northeast. Also, I believe you could not find another person among the old writers of geography who has traveled more than I." There are maps of the world by Strabo and by two much older Greek geographers, Herodotus and Eratosthenes, which Strabo had studied in Alexandria, and which, as you see, he changed but little. Herodotus had lived in Athens about 450 years ago, at the time of Socrates. As a boy, Strabo remembered hearing Cicero always refer to Herodotus as the father of geography. Eratosthenes had lived about 250 years later. He had been chief librarian at Alexandria. By measuring the length of the shadows thrown by the sun in different places on the earth, he had figured out for the first time the correct distance around the earth as being 200 or 25,000 miles. On his globe, Strabo showed all of the earth that he knew to be inhabited as island in the shape of the soldier's cape. "We have learned by experience that the inhabited world is an island," he explained, in discussing it with a group of fellow travelers, "because wherever it has been possible to reach the limits of the earth, sea has been found, and it is more than likely that the sea, which we call the Atlantic or outer ocean, is one and continuous." "In that case, you think it might be possible to sail around the world," surmised someone. "I do. If the size of it were not such an obstacle," he replied. "We might easily pass out through the Pillars of Hercules into the Atlantic Ocean and sail from Spain to India." "Has it ever been tried?" "Yes, and those who undertook it to sail around the globe turned back. They say not because any continent stood in their way, but because of the want and loneliness. Yet, on the other hand, he continued, it is quite possible that in the temperate zone there may be 2 or even more inhabitable islands, especially near the circle of latitude drawn through Athens. Another continent, perhaps, like that of Atlantis, would you say? Asked someone. He was referring to the old and familiar story of the long-lost continent, which had been related by Plato and which Plato had learned from the priests of Egypt when he studied them. Once in most ancient days, according to a tradition handed down by those Egyptian priests, there had been a continent in the Atlantic Ocean west of Africa known as Atlantis. But an upheaval had occurred in the bed of the ocean, and the continent had sunk completely and disappeared beneath the surface of the sea. Was the story true? Had such a continent ever existed? Had all the inhabitants perished, or did some of them escape? Was it a myth, or was it history? Those and other such questions kept the travelers on that ship in the Mediterranean speculating and surmising till the night was bright with stars. Strictly speaking, as a geographer, concluded Strabo, it is not my business to inquire whether or not there may be an inhabited continent. The object of a geographer is to describe known countries. Also, it would serve no purpose to be well acquainted with such distant places, especially if their inhabitants can neither injure us or nor benefit us by their commerce. Endure, I guess, not injure. And yet Strabo had shown that he found much in the same fascination in wondering about it that people today find it wondering whether Mars may possibly be inhabited. What if, instead of turning north, thought Strabo, late one afternoon as their ship was changing its course, what if our captain should steer directly west, and we go out through those pillars of Hercules and keep sailing on and on into the west till we could go no farther? Where would we land? What would we find? Where would they land? What would they find? Those were questions to which no one in Europe would know the answer for 1,500 years, not until 1492, when an Italian named Columbus, believing, as Strabo did, that it would be possible to sail around the world, was to set out for Spain to sail for India and land instead upon another continent.